Yeah, I did put those slides on the Discord channel from Gadamer, and I just wanted to see if maybe that might be fun to take a moment and work through.
Brock and Chuck discuss an interesting point of interpretation, examining a point from Hans-Georg Gadamer, today on generous theology.
Yeah, we can do that. I'll have to admit that I have not reviewed them. Like you said, sometimes it's fun to hit me cold. So I'm good with that if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, and I think too that it doesn't have to be a high-level treatment. It can just be a reaction. One of the interesting things to me about it is, from you and I being in the Reformed world, I'm very used to having a specified, well-defined set of hermeneutic principles, a set of interpretive guidelines that are commonly used to understand the biblical text. And of course, while the Reformed hermeneutics are helpful for understanding the biblical text, they also have applications in direct situations in life, such as ethics and other similar types of inquiries and endeavors. So anyway, I've always felt that it's been very difficult to get the same sort of thing from non-Reformed people for reasons that I don't know if I should say I don't understand, because part of me wants to pejoratively understand it, and maybe that's fair and maybe that's not fair. I find it convenient for a lot of people to come into ethical discussions and even discussions about interpretation and hermeneutics of text, come into it squishy and loose and very uncommittal. And I find that's a rhetorical tactic a lot of times, not necessarily that people don't have some sort of hermeneutics that they apply to philosophy, theology, ethics, but rather that rhetorically it's oftentimes convenient to obscure what those philosophical principles are for the sake of making it harder to tactically lose an argument. And maybe that's fair. Maybe that's a fair characterization, especially in light of what you and I talked about earlier with Zygmunt Bauman's idea of liquid modernity. And this idea of the characterization that I used was, remember the pirates' hermeneutical principles from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies? Keep to the code, more like guidelines, meaning that things could be basically very fluid depending on the situation and also depending on what is to personal advantage. And so for me, there was a treasure here. There was something important. There was something wonderful about finding someone outside of the Reformed tradition who's written at length and in great detail about their modern phenomenological hermeneutical principles. And so we have this Hans-Georg Gadamer, who is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century from the phenomenological tradition. And he's written philosophical hermeneutics text. He's also discussed, I think Truth and Method is his other most famous work. And so he's gone on record, as it were. And so I think we can benefit from that. And so I shared some slides with you, and we can go through that. I just wanted to do an introductory flyover of one particular aspect that comes out of the preface. The Philosophical Hermeneutics of Gadamer, the edition that I'm looking at, is translated and edited by David Linge, or Linge, I hope I'm saying that. And during the preface, Linge has some ideas about Gadamer's work that are sort of summary, guiding, and helpful principles for setting the stage to then read Gadamer's text. And so I appreciate this, but I think that's where these particular sections are coming from for tonight. So they're coming from Linge's preface to Gadamer's work on the philosophical hermeneutics. So that's a long introduction. And before we get into that, Chuck, I just wanted to throw open to you to talk about, from your perspective, what you think about when you hear the term hermeneutics, how you might evaluate Reformed hermeneutics, and especially in a compare and contrast mode with other cultures and other worldviews and systems of thought that maybe you've experienced use the idea of hermeneutic differently. How does that part strike you?
Yeah, no. So first of all, just the concept of hermeneutics, I remember being introduced to it as a freshman in high school. And at that point, I was in my freshman Bible class that the teacher decided that he was going to have a section on hermeneutics. And it was pretty basic given that we were freshman school. But it was at this point that we learned basic historical redemptive methods versus critical methods and some other types of hermeneutical principles, and I just got the basics. The next time I really dealt with them was not so much by anyone who uses the term hermeneutics, but realistically, that's what it is. And that was in law school. And in coming up with, in discussing how do you interpret constitutions, statutes, case law, that kind of thing. And there are canons of construction that are generally, at least in common law, and common law was the law of the British, and it's been adopted. Common law has been, for the most part, adopted by the United States and Canada and some other countries that were at one point within the British orbit, as opposed to strictly statutory or code systems where everything is laid out in code form. Napoleonic codes were the originator of that, and so you see that outside of that Anglo-American world, although there are a few exceptions even to that. Louisiana and Quebec, having had some impact by the French, have some forms of that more code form of governance. But in any case, in studying what the common law says about these canons of construction and how now we often have statutes as well, set those out in a typical set of state statutes, for example, there are some introductory statutes or some basic statutes that lay those things out. We got some sense of how that works for law. The next time I really dealt with it was in conjunction with both my legal career and how it's crossed my work in the church. And I can't get into a lot of details because the actual cases we dealt with are confidential, but I served for 6 years on our denomination's judicial code committee. And in that role, what we would do would be adjudicate church disputes, often involving people who are alleging some kind of wrongdoing, perhaps by somebody with some authority, a pastor or a church council or a classist, and we would adjudicate those things. And what we found is that at the time, the Judicial Code Committee was made up of, I think, 7 lawyers and 2 pastors, and it was set up to be 2 pastors and 7 others. And sort of the way to deal with it was they would generally say, who is not a pastor who would be good at this stuff? It must be lawyers. So they would appoint a bunch of lawyers to these, and we would find that the lawyers would become very often very critical of how pastors and church authorities would deal with their own rules. You start with church order, and then from church order you might have classist rules of order and congregational rules of order for their church councils, and then there were often other things like rules for synodical procedure, rules for classical procedure, those kinds of things, and then even down to how do you interpret Robert's rules of order, because a lot of councils and classes and synods will use Robert's rules as the go-to. If there isn't already a rule of procedure, they'll go to this rule. And what the lawyers would often complain about is that interpretations being made by these church bodies were not following what we considered typical canons of construction. And not only that, but we would make the argument that it made a lot of sense to use these canons of construction because there were similarities between legal canons of construction used in the Anglo-American world, and since we're a binational U.S. and Canadian denomination, that's what we were generally dealing with, and with scripture, and how interpretations of scripture would be made. And so we would make these cases. Hey, we ought to interpret these rules in light of not just simply looking at it in all by itself, i.e. proof texting, but rather we have to consider the whole of the rules, just as in Scripture. We often interpret Scripture in the light of Scripture. And that we would look at the purposes of particular provisions, and in the same way that we often look at genre, and we look at the purpose of particular types of biblical writings and how they fit in to the redemption story. And in the same way, canons of construction are designed to fit into sort of a framework for the purpose of these things. And the pastors would be like, that's interesting, but we were always taught that the way you interpret these things is that you go to some expert, usually somebody at the seminary, and just ask them, and whatever they say goes. And we'd be like, so where does it say in church order that Professor DeMore or Professor Smith is, those are the two church polity professors at Calvin Seminary for the past number of decades, that their decision is what holds in these cases. And then, no, it doesn't really say that, but that's just how we've always done it. And so we would have these discussions. And oftentimes, as a result of that, code committee would come back and perhaps with some criticism for how some church authorities, church bodies handled certain things, and would instruct them to go back and do it differently or take into account some of our criticisms. And that got to the point where there was some criticism of the Judicial Code Committee, and they actually changed the rules and decided that there could be no more than two lawyers on there anymore. So now it's two pastors, two lawyers, and five others that are neither pastors nor lawyers. And I think they did that in hopes of perhaps challenging some of our quote unquote hermeneutical statements about how do you construct these rules. Now, and I bring that up not so much as a criticism, particularly of my denomination, because I think that kind of experience for attorneys is actually rather common. And I've talked to other people about it, and not just in the church world, but all over the place. And part of the reason for it is, I think, that we don't talk about hermeneutics or canons of construction very much in the real world anymore. We don't talk about how do we do interpretations. And certainly people who are not highly involved in academics and philosophical arguments certainly don't really talk about it that often. And I think there was probably a time, I'm thinking, that maybe sometimes that was part of one's education, that you think about how to interpret words and what are the principles for interpretation. And I think that's gone away. And so what it gets replaced by, and it can be a couple of things. One, it can be replaced by the liquid modernity sort of method that we talked about a number of weeks ago, which is things are liquid and we change the rules as we see fit, as it seems appropriate. Maybe there are some general rules in the back of people's heads about how you make those changes and when you make the changes, but yet it's all sort of squishy and liquid, and you never know quite what the rules are going to be. Another way I think sometimes happens is what I expressed, which is let's just rely on some expert, and whatever they say goes, and we may not understand it. It may not necessarily make a lot of sense to us, but what other option do we have but to rely on some expert? And depending on who that expert is and how much they know about the actual kind of topics that get discussed, that can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, but you also then don't have certainty because you're relying on someone all the time to interpret it. I think the third way that it gets interpreted, and not so much interpreted as fought over, is that when it comes to a dispute about how to interpret something, the majority rules or the strongest person wins. And in that method, again, you have no idea what the interpretation is going to be because it's all decided by the majority, or it's all decided by the people who have the loudest voices, or the people who have the best capability of bringing together their arguments against people who maybe aren't as skilled at making those arguments. And so that can vary from time to time as well. So that's all to say that I appreciate, just like you did, and as you mentioned, the fact that we do have Gadamer doing some writing on this, and at least in the context of philosophy, talking about some level of hermeneutics, some level of interpretive canons for how we think through philosophy. And it's good to be able to look at them and compare them with the things that we know, and to be able to discuss what are the strengths and weaknesses of certain hermeneutical systems, including Gadamer's, and B, to also make the case that even if we disagree with the particular hermeneutical principles, it is always going to be to our benefit to know what those hermeneutical principles are that are being used and applied, and to be able to cite to those rules so that when people aren't even consistent in applying their own hermeneutical principles, we can make that case and deal with it that way. So It's a long monologue here, but that's my history with these ideas, and one reason why I have a great deal of interest in them. So even though I'm kind of coming cold to what Gadamer is saying, it is something that really definitely interests me.